Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the China Seminar Series. My name is Xian Wang. I am a postdoctoral fellow, and I also specialize in modern Chinese history. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respect to the elders past and present. Our special speaker today is Professor Yu Tao. He is an associate professor and coordinator of Chinese studies at the University of Western Australia. His research examines governance, religion, migration, and cultural heritage in the context of global China. He's an executive and the publications officer of the Asian Studies Association of Australia, the China editor of the Asian Studies Review, and the recipient of the Australian Award for University Teaching. Today, his talk is titled Maritime Heritage and Local Governance in Contemporary China. Now, please join us in welcoming Professor Tao.
Thank you very much, Wang Laoshi, for your very generous introduction. And thank you so much, friends that I've met and I haven't met. And thank you for coming here. Before I start, I really want to just say that I'm so grateful for the center to give me the opportunity to come here to visit. And I really gained quite a lot in the last 8 weeks. In fact, I want to start from Canberra. So I'm leaving actually tomorrow. So to many people, this might be imagined as a 汇报演出. So I'm reporting what I've done here. To manage your expectation, it's not. It's actually really a working in progress. So I'm very grateful for any of the comments, questions, feedbacks that you're going to give me. Now, I want to start from this map, which is of course close to home here. Many of you, of course, all of you, I suppose, can directly recognize ACT. But one thing that people normally say that ACT as an Australian territory is so different from all other territories or states is in the fact that it's landlocked. That is a fact now. That wasn't a fact, perhaps, for those of you who are not that familiar with Australian politics. That wasn't a fact until 1988, when ACT actually gained the self-governing autonomy from the federal government. And before that, how many of us actually heard about this little territory there called Jervis Bay Territory? Some of you might actually visit there. I've never had the opportunity. I first came to Australia in 2011 as a graduate student. And that was the years after financial crisis. And ANU was so rich that it reimbursed everything that we fled from Oxford here. But even that times, friends here talk to me that don't think ACT or Canberra is just like, or Canberra maybe, as a landlocked city. I mean, there is an entrance to the ocean, if you like. In fact, just very recently, when I had dinner with friends, and there is a professor says that while he would live in any Australian cities because they are all ocean faced, and then he quickly added, but probably not Canberra because it doesn't have this access to ocean. The point here, though, is and in fact, I think if someone wants to develop a new research project, probably I know that ANU has the very worldly famous, critical heritage studies center here. From a critical heritage studies point, this is great topic that the Australian politicians, people, so obsessed, with the access to ocean and what has shaped that kind of, imagination or desire. I think that's a good research topic, not in my area. Of course, today I want to talk that kind of a desire towards the ocean, whether or not that was shaped by the historical, facts or memories, or that's speaking to the contemporary demands. Whatever is the case, that's not exclusive to Australia. And if we, extend our vision across the oceans, it's the same story happening in contemporary China. Now, Xian's already introduced me in a very generous way. I will just skip this very quickly. Apart from, I would say that I come from really a local governance perspective, right? And I started my research studying religious groups, local governments, do they interact with each other? Now, I think it's probably not only my circumstance that since or in the last 10 years, doing religious studies is more and more difficult in local China. However, I'm also not subscribed to another discourse saying that doing research in China now is so difficult that it looks like we're back to 60 years ago, right? A scholar actually said that here last year. Um, the, the truth is, I think when John and Anita interview people in Hong Kong, you probably find difficulties to go to mainland China, and nowadays we can. Of course, you can't research some topics in China, but I find that the heritage, or heritage discourse, heritage policy. In fact, today I'm mostly going to talk about the intangible cultural heritage. And that's if you talk with local governments, local government officials about that, they're very happy, very proud about their innovations, achievements in doing this. So I find, yes, religious I can no longer study, or it's very difficult to study that in China through field work. But through seeing how local governments manage and governing their heritages, especially intangible cultural heritage, you can still gain so much about the governance in local China, and I suppose that's my interest today. So today's talk will have 4 parts. I'll start to introduce a little bit of some background why we put, or why I would like to put maritime heritage and local governance, these two things together, and why China is a great case for us to study this topic. Then I will give a little bit of the political context, just as I shared with you about my observation and reflections on ACT and Australia's obsession towards the access to ocean. The maritime heritage, or this whole kind of a China is not only a land country, but also is a rising power, rising ocean power. That's become more and more obviously, explicitly in the official narrative in China, of course, mainly from the central government. But nevertheless, I think that provide a great platform, for the local authorities to make use of that narrative to advance their own agendas there. And that's what I'm going to talk to you in the third part, the patterns there. And finally, I'm going to offer some reflections, three reflections there. So let's from the background. Look, this is not an official map. It's not even the Communist Party of China's, the CCP's kind of claim of the maritime territories that China has. But this is a map from a Chinese company trying to sell their service to people in China, but they try to say that their satellite coverage goes not only covers the land, but also it goes to cover all these kind of maritime territories that closer to China all the way to the Japanese archipelago. The point here is that, of course, China has this vast maritime geography there, and then there has been quite a lot of intangible cultural heritage related to the provinces, that on the coastline. So, just as a matter of fact, I suppose that China has, also quite kind of a, vast access to the ocean as it has, to the land. But what's more interesting, though, I mean, in my recent research and inspired by my colleagues' research, I find that China is playing an expanding role in the global ICH, intangible cultural heritage, governance. So China not only, ratified the 2003 UNESCO Convention very early on, but then it made a national law about the intangible cultural heritage. And that then use that law and then a hierarchy of the central law, the provincial regulations, the local, policy, documents to really set up the whole kind of a model or the governance structure to manage maritime heritage or any, intangible cultural heritage. But not only that, China is trying to, sell or promote that kind of model, not only in China, but with the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm going to talk a little bit more, abroad, but also directly, participate in the bidding for more and more Chinese items, elements to be put in the inventory of the UNESCO. We'll talk a little bit about the motivations there, of course. But the point is that from the UNESCO perspective, China is a very, very keen participant in this, global enterprise of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, whereas America, United States, stopped or massively reduced, if not stopped, is investment to international organizations, especially UNESCO, which it probably thinks is a little bit too culture. So for UNESCO's perspective, China is also like a major stakeholder now. So no matter if you come to this topic from a intangible cultural heritage governance perspective, or if you want to know more about Chinese politics, I suppose maritime intangible cultural heritage does provide a good lens. So as promised, I want to talk a little bit before I went to the policy or go to the policy. I want to talk a little bit about the political context here. And that's probably some of the things that friends here are interesting. So China's transition towards a traditional kind of a land-focused country to now become a very active, voice maker on the international arena regarding its demand, its desire towards ocean, that really happened in Xi Jinping's leadership. I mean, before that, there were, you can, if you want to find evidence, you can always find, right? China sent ships to the, North Pole or South Pole. That could be, be think as a part of its claim of the maritime, power, but also even before she, of course, China sent scientific research ships to South China Sea, and many people, of course, see that as a territorial claim exercise rather than an actual scientific research. Probably a bit of both, I think. But the difference between, in my opinion, between Xi's era and so the new era and the previous era is that China's demand to, or China's claim to be a maritime power become very explicit, both to the audience abroad, but also to its own people. And a key milestone, of course, is 2013, the launch of the 21st century maritime Silk Road, which Xi Jinping did that in Indonesia in 2013, and their complement, at that time, early kind of designing of the Belt and Road Initiative. So officially making, these ocean connections a part of China's blueprint towards a world order, in the future, more or less. And that's in 2017, in the 19th CPC National Congress, really get, consolidated. And from then on, the propaganda is not only towards international audience, but also domestic audience. And that you will see gradually provide platforms for local government to do a little bit more. And then, of course, this maritime community with a shared future. I don't know how many community with the shared future that China has now already designed there. I actually had a student do a little bit of research on that. I think he's find more than 10, but it's still increasing. So maritime is one of the early ones actually that China, so we talk about the motivations of China trying to get in some of these maritime heritage or more so the intangible cultural heritage thing into the UNESCO inventory. And one of the motivation on the central government level, of course, this is quite a good thing to connect China with the other places that traditionally you have a high percent of overseas Chinese population, or nowadays we say Chinese diasporic communities, especially in Southeast Asia. I'm going to come back to these inventories and talk about them in a little bit more details. But clearly, that's one of the motivations for the central government to emphasize that, because you see that they talk about that quite a lot. But also, I mean, again, I mean, as I said, this is not only about the international audience, and the Chinese government also write those all this like marine culture or develop or safeguarding intangible cultural heritage with link to ocean into its national development plan. So, and I will explain a little bit in my next few slides why, if you were a policy expert in China and you expert in heritage safeguarding, heritage conservation, and nowadays it's very nature, to link development with conservation with safeguarding. The reason being, remember I said that China developed national law and then the whole hierarchical governance structure about that. Very how to say a very clear characteristics with the or a very clear pattern with the Chinese characteristics is to link development, link economic development, in fact, and other policy goals directly, explicitly with the safeguarding conservation. And that's all from the national level, initiative to the local initiative. And I'm going to show you a little bit some examples here. In fact, I should have directly come to these slides, which actually talk about, this state-led safeguarding framework. So, of course, I mean, when we talk about China, lots of people would think, sure, I mean, lots of things are state-led. For example, we have, lots of state-owned enterprise, and then there's no separation between the party army and the nation army. So, but when it comes to the intangible cultural heritage safeguarding framework, it's very interesting. It's not that the state directly mobilize its own institutions get into this field. Quite differently, the state here provide a platform to explicitly, as I said, linked, you know, safeguarding of intangible heritage with the developmental goals and other goals as well. So it actually create opportunities, new opportunities for the state and non-state actors here. And lots of, as you probably can imagine, lots of the actors in the actual conservation or safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage are small players, small workshops, small collectives, and they're not kind of a state-controlled economy. And we're talking about very small scale economy there, but nevertheless, the state see these policy areas as place that it can allow, it mobilize these non-state sectors to basically stimulating the local economy, especially as the general economic situation nowadays in China is not all that optimistic. Okay, so I talked quite a lot about this abstract, context there, and let's go to some actual things. The first thing that I'll have to say that despite that I've been talking quite a lot about the maritime heritage and how Chinese central government is very keen in promoting this on the international stage. In fact, in comparison with other fields, I mean, the actual maritime intangible cultural elements recognized by UNESCO that related to China is not that many. It's just three, strictly speaking, right? But later I will tell you why it's way more than that. So strictly speaking, there are only three elements there, or three items there. One is, of course, Mazu. I think people heard about that. I'll come back to that later, because it means so much to the local government. and not only in the region's traditional related with the Mazu belief. The other is a fairly new, item. It's called Song Wang Chuan or Angchuan, which is Hakka, I think. Speaking of that, that ritual was jointly nominated by China and Malaysia, especially Penang and other, Chinese, ethnically Chinese people's, kind of a gathering places. Yinxin probably knows quite a lot of that. So those are the only, if you strictly speaking about intangible cultural heritage, these are the only two, right? And then of course there is the making of the Chinese junks. That's counted as another. But you can see all of these have very symbolic values for the Chinese state, and in particular China's central state, because they do maintain or reinforce, enhance the ties, or at least provide opportunities for the Chinese government to enhance its ties with the overseas Chinese communities there. And the Chinese government sometimes do that, and then encourage, if not directly subsidize this joint celebration. For example, Song Wang Chuan, that's quite popular now. But I'm sorry, that's a little bit small, and in fact, it needs a little bit of update anyway. So, yeah, don't pay too much attention to the figures. I will explain the patterns here. So, what is that form? And there will be a couple of forms after this. So, I think, as in any other countries, the importance of us understanding the cultural heritage safeguarding or management or governing is really to see, which items were recognized by the state. And of course, Professor Laura Jane Smith, who's working here, and one of her fundamental contribution, I think essential contribution to heritage studies, is that this notion of authorized heritage discourse, that state-sponsored heritage thing. So if we want to understand, for example, how Chinese state really kind of want to or emphasize or not, on maritime ICIH, then study those items that officially recognized in China's national inventories is a thing that you can do relatively easily and give you an overall kind of a view of the pattern. So a colleague of mine, Xu Yawen and me, we did this together, but this hasn't been fully upgraded because last year, 2025, China actually also had a 6 inventory there, but the pattern pretty similar. In fact, if you look, because there's more and more elements in the in the inventories still. I mean, even though China has been talking quite a lot in the central government, about this maritime power, and lots of people writing about that. Ed wrote great papers on that. Zhu Yujie, my friend who's not here today, he also wrote about that. But the actual central state recognized maritime heritage items are still remain fairly low, 2.5% or something like that. And so unsurprisingly, all of these concentrate on the coastal provinces, and especially you could see that Guangdong or Zhejiang or Fujian, this traditionally southeast, is it southeast? Yes, southeast provinces, and they're leading that pattern. Of course, some people have good eyesight. You probably recognize Shandong must be a extremely different case, which is the case, and it's very interesting. I'm going to give you a case study later, what Shandong is doing and why it also, make itself apart from these provinces, very keen on promoting that. Because you could say that Guangdong, Zhejiang, Fujian, they all more or less subscribe to the central government's blueprint that connect with the overseas Chinese, but Shandong traditionally not in our mind, right? So that's an interesting case. We're going to see more later. And most of these initiatives are on the very lower or middle to lower kind of how to say political level in China's governance hierarchy, mainly on the county level, and some of them in the municipal level. And many are these kind of 文化事业单位, right? So they're not entirely government organization, but they're public institutions. So public culture institutions, they are mainly kind of governing these things, and especially on the country level. I'll have some reflections in the end about that. But before that, I want to just quickly talk about these motivations and roles of local states. Of course, I mean, they can, taking advantage of the World Heritage status. And then there is this production-based safeguarding model, which allows them to very unshamefully and proudly, shall we say, link safeguarding with commerce, with all sorts of business models. So it does help them with the political and more so the economic development goals. Of course, in China, economic development goals sometimes can be political if you do believe in the promotion tournament model, which sometimes works, sometimes not. So that's all very abstract. I didn't go through that page very carefully because I do have these cases elaborated for you. So if you still remember, one of the earliest, and in fact, still to this day, one of the two intangible cultural heritage that China has on the maritime heritage and recognized by UNESCO is this Mazu, right? Mazu belief. Some friends here probably know Mazu very well, and others might not. It's really a sea goddess emerged in Southeast China and mainly in Fujian because they're saying that Mazu had a surname of Ling. Ling is big, surname in Fujian, and then she protect the fishermen and other ocean activities. There are different, different talking about that. So nowadays, each year you do have this Kai Hai, which literally means open the sea ceremony linked with Mazu beliefs. And then China now has this annual kind of ceremony of Mazu. So this become pretty official in the sense that you normally have a wise national figure coming from Beijing, normally the vice chairperson of the People's Congress or the consultancy kind of the 政协, they come to the local place, and then every year, of course, there's a Kai Hai, this open sea ceremony, and then for local government, this is quite a rare opportunity to host leaders at that level. So if you were a local governor or local mayor, in fact, or the head of a county, that probably does create you an opportunity to link with the political resources. Otherwise, you can't, right? But more so, I mean, all of this Mazu thing is linked with Tongzhanbu United Fund, and then always coupling with that is the Taiwanese merchants and merchants from Southeast Asia. They all come here and making that another Guangjiao Hui. Zhuang just mentioned that in his early career. So this is, become a trade fair, right? All of these are easy to understand, I suppose, until I tell you this political picture is not in Fujian or Guangzhou or Guangdong. It's in Shandong. Look, I mean, I never heard about Mazu also went to Shandong, but of course, I think it's very easy to imagine. Or in fact, when you talk with people, there's always this kind of normally female figure, goddess, associated with the ocean. Of course, whether or not Mazu is Tianhou, we're not necessarily sure, right? They could come from different source, could be the same, but what eventually, become Mazu in the Southeast China or now became a cultural resources for any ocean linked county in China who used to have this goddess figure whether or not you call that 天后 or 天妃, right, or whatever, and they all become Mazu. And it might sound ridiculous. So whether or not Mazu should become 天妃, right? At the end of the day, 天后 and 天妃, these are honorary titles, whereas Mazu is a specific goddess, right? So in a normal logic, it should be the other way around, right? So you have an honorary, yes? Yeah. This is it's not Qingdao, actually, it's Zibo, I think. Yeah, so but this is in Zibo, but maybe that's the point. That's how they actually get these things worked. But it's very interesting that because uh, whether or not, as I said, it normally makes more logic that Mazu become Tianhou because he give Mazu or any goddess a honorary title. But in this field that all of these become cultural resources, people will still locally talk about Tianhou or Tianfei, right? So for example, in my hometown, Taicang, where Zheng He set his, set off for his voyages, and then there is this Tianhou Gong Tianfei Miao, and they not yet claim that as Mazu, right? But if you want to do this Mazu, ceremony, then you have to, of course, find a link there. But even in Shandong, I mean, it's very interesting that how the local government get these cultural resources and link their cultural roots, or maybe as Sophie said or Sarah said, maybe they rediscover their roots. I don't know, but normally, I mean, we don't normally link Shandong with these Mazu ideas, and I don't know that 800 years. So you were talking about probably Song Dynasty or early Song Dynasty, which is the time is right. Yeah, it's Tianhou, right? It's not necessarily Mazu, but they now become Mazu because with this, then you can hold this Kaihai thing, and with the Kaihai thing, the local cultures get quite a lot. I didn't directly interview them, but I did have a student interview them, and then have this all sorts of resources politically, symbolically, but also more importantly, the commercial, kind of resources linked with that. So the state, of course, create these narratives, and then you have local government interpret uh, their local cultural resources to, gain support from the central state to host these international events and eventually to advance their local economic agendas. And another way that local governments use these cultural resources happens in Quanzhou, which is quite interesting because Quanzhou, of course, traditionally is associated with the World Heritage and associated with the maritime roots, and it was preserved or I mean kept as a important port, a port that still have these architectures of Song and Yuan. Of course, later there's so many different things, different meanings were put there. For example, multiculturalism, right? So you have Muslim temples and other things or mosques. But interesting though, uh, Quanzhou, of course, we know is a World Heritage Site. So it is recognized by the UNESCO, but it was recognized by UNESCO in 2021 as, basically a live museum of Song and Yuan China. It's not necessarily this maritime heritage thing or anything relevant really to the intangible cultural heritage. It's entirely a cultural heritage, a kind of a tangible, like the heritage site. But what the Quanzhou government did is that it really also revitalized this Mazu worship ceremony. And that's fine because you can say that's still drawing the official line. But they also kind of find lots of local, heritage resources, the Nanyin music, the puppet theater, and all of these things were put into the local development plans. And then you have the entire, city district dedicated to the intangible cultural heritage. Why is that? Well, again, I'm calling this interviewed local officials, and their view is that the intangible cultural heritage has a lower threshold, 低门槛, for local people to get in and trying to cash out some of the heritage there. And they, of course, also host lots of culture festivals there. And then inbred with the digital platforms, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in my next slides, not this one. This one, in this slide, I want to talk that how local government really use, the intangible cultural heritage practitioners as a force or mobilize them for local economic development. What they do is through two routes. The first route is, of course, even if this is all about intangible cultural heritage, so if we have colleagues here coming from the, I forgot the center, Laura Jane Smith Center, talking about the heritage safeguarding, and I totally agree with them, right? So intangible cultural heritage safeguarding fundamentally is about preserve human knowledge on a particular way of life or making things. So, which means that if this particular intangible cultural heritage is about how to process fish in Zhoushan, that means not only people in Zhoushan, but any of us, regardless of our race and ethnicity, as long as we subscribe to the local values and then the knowledge of the tradition, if we know that, we could be, in theory, a practitioner of the intangible heritage. Of course, there's huge debates on that. But in China, of course, it's completely different. I mean, it's a little bit like what France did to Champagne or the European. It's recognition of where you come from, and then it become a commercial protection scheme for people who does this. But eventually, is what they want to see is the products of the ICH become commercial products and they can be sold, right? So which means that even if you use the entirely, technique and then the knowledge of that, if you're not from Zhoushan, not processing Zhoushan, you cannot claim that's a ICH. So that's how local government also try to protect, or you can say enhance their local production resources. But the other part of the development is really tourism. So the whole production-based heritage safeguarding is actually, in the end, I think there's two patterns. One is translate intangible cultural heritage into something, becomes sellable, purchasable in the market, and the other is the tourism. But of course, the tourism, they sometimes, well, most times they bring in private capital there. And then it's not only nowadays confined to the actual, tourism. So people come and they look around and they go. There are lots of this immersion emphasized. So for example, Jingdezhen, which as academics, we shouldn't make predictions, but I think it will get its World Heritage status this year. If it doesn't get, I will be very surprised. But Jingdezhen people traditionally link with the China making, right? But it's not only about people come to Jingdezhen and look at how these combs actually work. That will be what it puts into the World Heritage, or it has already put in the World Heritage nomination document. But really, what makes money for people in Jingdezhen is how people come and learn how to make these things with masters. But of course, sometimes they also make these whole things beyond, the physical setting and go into the cyberspace. What time? I think I always speak too much, so let me have a look. Okay, I already spoke for 40 minutes. I thought only half an hour. But anyway, so I do have a few reflections I want to share with all of us. And then after that, I'm open for questions. Now, some key takeaways. I think maritime culture, intangible cultural heritage, of course, has gained increasing attention from the Chinese state. But what I try to show you today is that I think the logic for the central state and the logic of the local state, even though they seemingly all support this gigantic, direction of development, the motivation and logic are quite different. I think quite a lot of good scholarship has been focused on the central state's motivation and even the deeper, historical reasons or contemporary demands shaped with this, increasing emphasis on China's, entitlement, shall I say, on the ocean rights. But the local state seemingly, on the surface, be loyal supporters of the central policy, but that's only because the central policy give them so much benefits that they can claim directly locally. Otherwise, I'm not so sure. Um, so that's basically, I think, the key takeaways there. Of course, I mean, it doesn't mean that the local state do whatever they want, right? The local state can advance their agendas only within the political and policy framework that central states set there. Of course, local state and central state look at different things, but for example, if central state or even the international region is talking about Mazu, right, then you don't say that we are very proud of our Tianhou. Quite the opposite, you say that our Tianhou is a version of Mazu as well, and then you participate in this resource allocation enterprise, I suppose. But of course, whether or not local state actually care about the, internationalization, in some sense, yes, it want international investments. It want more buyers and investors from abroad. But I don't think many of them really kind of keen on if you talk with cultures, keen on talking about, China's ocean rights or something like that. So that really goes back to a local governance model that my colleagues and I probably, we only published in Chinese about 10-ish years ago to understand the selective implementation of the policy initiatives in China. So why certain policies, so difficult, for the central to to give to local, whereas in other cases, the local government really do more than, be more Catholic than the Pope, do more than the central ask. And in other times, of course, they ignore the central policy altogether. At that time, we have the two tiers model there. We based on the village and the township, but I think you can loosely interpret this as the relationship between the central, local, upper level and the lower level government. So we find that if you got these policies, it's very emphasized by the central, and they need to be able to measure, then of course the local government will have a point to do that. But whether or not, in a good way, that the intangible cultural heritage safeguarding kind of enterprises like this, the central government do emphasize that because of all sorts of political reasons. And it's very easy to measure for them as well, how many activities you have done, how many things you put in the inventory. But that itself is not the whole story. Also because it creates so many opportunities for the local institutions to advance their own agenda locally and very timely. So they really kind of, more enthusiastic sometimes than the central I suppose, or I mean, I'm not sure if more enthusiastic than central, but they're very enthusiastic, right? Which come to my final point is not on my slides, but I did mention earlier, and I made that point last year in another talk, which is this remind us to also think about the very key issue of running any cultural institution, I suppose, not only the heritage things, is that so in the China model, of course, nowadays, especially as I talk in such a way, you probably see that lots of this cultural heritage safeguarding became a vehicle for economic gain. And you might be thinking, does that not reduce the purpose or the meaning of the cultural institutions themselves? The short answer is, of course, yes, because if you then want to talk about authenticity to protecting, or safeguarding the vulnerable groups' access to knowledge, there's all sorts of question there because the motivation come from the market, and then lots of this safeguarding practice really subscribe to the market's needs and imagination, and local government sometimes push things go towards that direction. However, I don't think that's the whole story here. Think about our cultural institutions in Australia. Think about the cultural institution I visited in Canada and in New Zealand, just in fact, within the last 8 weeks. I find that lots of cultural institutions, they're not running very healthily. They don't get enough public money. They're not valued really. Whereas in some of these Chinese counties, cultural institutions used to be considered as precisely, marginalized and provide service, not generating incomes. But some of them now become pretty influential, pretty visible. Um, you know, so people ask their opinions about things because they bring in money. So in that regard, we can question about China's practice regarding intangible cultural heritage and the possible problems it might cause on the actual safeguarding of ICH. But on the other hand, they do make cultural institutions more central in the local, political, local social lives. So in that regard, I don't think we can just dismiss, all of these things as a money-making scheme because they do, on the other hand, has an impact on how cultural institutions, find their way in the modern society, especially when the public funding is getting reduced. And that's a problem not only facing China, but facing many countries. I think I'll stop there. Very happy to answer any questions.